In chapter 1 of Genesis, we read about the creation, and we put that into the context that the Hebrews of the time understood. That is, we looked at the heavens and the earth according to their cosmology. And we looked at the things that God had created and how Moses rejected the gods of Egypt by tossing them completely out of the story. In chapter 2, we read about the creation of man and of woman, two very different beings. If you've ever met a man and a woman, very different beings, yet one made from the other, so that after they had been separated, they could be brought together again to become a whole being. We read about how life in the garden of God was perfect and how it was a slice of the heavens on earth, a place where man could come and could dwell with God. In chapter 3, in chapter 3, we read about the fall, how woman and then man bought into the lie of the snake, the Nahash, the great monster of the ancient and primordial past, the lie that God could not be trusted to have our best interests at heart. Rather, the man and the woman wanted to do their own thing. And in so doing, God sent them out of his garden so that they could do their own thing. We also read about the curse that God had placed on the Nahash, that one day a man would be born of woman who would destroy the Nahash. In chapter 4, we read about God's abundant and unrelenting desire to turn the first murderer, Cain, back to himself. And if God were this persistent with a murderer like Cain, surely he would look on us with favor as well. People like Lamech, Cain's great-great-great-grandson, who understood that if God would defend Cain, then surely God would defend those less guilty than he. And this brings us to chapter 5, which serves more as a bit of a time warp in the story. Moses lists out 10 generations, starting with Adam and ending with the next important character in the story, Noah. What we will notice about the people in the story is this. They get really, really incredibly old, which we'll talk about when we hit the end of the chapter. So first, we're going to start, of course, with verses 1 and 2 of chapter 5, Genesis. This is the book of the generations of Adam. When God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. Male and female he created them, and he blessed them and named them man when they were created. We start with a reminder of what man is. Man is made in the likeness of God. He doesn't look like God. Rather, he carries in himself the imprint of the divine. Every other creature in God's creation, whether physical or spiritual, stands warned that this creature, these humans, including all their descendants after them, exist to reflect God himself. Verse 3. When Adam had lived 130 years, he fathered a son in his own likeness, after his image, and he named him Seth. Just like man was made in God's image, Seth also carried the image of his father. So, what does this mean? From generation to generation, we carry the imprint and image of those who came before us. Whether we like it or not, whether it's fair or not, your place in this world is driven in large part by your ancestors, by their choices, by their circumstances, by the unfair things that may have happened to them. I consider a few extreme examples. Under most slavery systems, the children of slaves are themselves enslaved. They didn't earn it. It came with the territory, you might say. In nearly every culture, the children of aristocrats are themselves aristocrats. The children of the wealthy usually have access to more wealth. The children of Harvard alumni have access to Harvard, and the children of disfavored families are themselves disfavored. But beyond wealth or nobility or caste, even shameful choices made by members of families carry down to their generation. Not by making their children do the same shameful things that they did, but by having to deal with the ramifications of what Dad did or what Aunt Jane did or what Grandpa Paul did. Was your mother a marriage hopper? that's going to have ramifications on whether or not people trust you. And not only so, it's going to have serious impact upon whether or not you trust your own spouse either. Adam and Eve carried the shame of the first sin. They carried the shame of being those who brought the first great disappointment and condemnation to this otherwise perfect world. And now Seth, being born in his father's image, also carried that same shame. He didn't carry the sin of his father, as though he had to actually pay for Adam's sin all over again. No one other than Adam, or in his place, Christ, would need to answer for his sin. But he did carry the shame of that sin. And we all do. Although some of us feel it more than others, I suppose. For we all descend from our Father. It's the mutual sin of being a creature who, like Adam, looks first to our own desires before we look to the desires of God. From generation to generation, forever thereafter, sons and daughters are brought into this world, and we carry in our very persons the image of our fathers and of our mothers. For many of us, we've struggled hard to overcome that image. For others, we embrace that image proudly. Most of us, we've got a big bag and mixture of both. Ultimately, though, that image extends back through Adam to the image of God himself, which through our ancestors has been passed down to us. This is an image not filled with shame, but one that is filled with great glory and great hope, with love, with peace, and all of those great things that come with being made in the image of the eternal God. But it's become distorted and bent. But, it is there. And God calls on each one of us to restore that image of himself, no matter how bent it is in our lives, to restore that image of himself to its perfect glory. Now we're going to read a whole bunch, verses 4 to 24, because we're not going to stop and comment about everybody on the way through. The days of Adam after he fathered Seth were 800 years. Whew. And he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days that Adam lived were 930 years, and he died. When Seth had lived 105 years, he fathered Enosh. Seth lived after he fathered Enosh 807 years, and he had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Seth were 912 years, and he died. When Enosh had lived 90 years, he fathered Kenan. Enosh lived after he fathered Kenan 815 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. When Kenan had lived 70 years, he fathered Mahalalel. Kenan lived after he fathered Mahalalel 840 years and had other sons and daughters. By the way, that's a great thing to name your kids. Mahalalel, just remember that. Thus all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Your son Mahalalel may not like you for it, though. When Mahalalel had lived 65 years, he fathered Jared. Mahalalel lived after he fathered Jared 830 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. When Jared had lived 162 years, he fathered Enoch. Jared lived after he fathered Enoch 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Jared were 962 years, and he died. When Enoch had lived, let's see here. Yeah, okay. When Enoch had lived 65 years, he fathered Methuselah. Enoch walked with God after he fathered Methuselah 300 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. All right. The life of Enoch is one in which we really know basically nothing at all. But clearly Enoch must have been special enough that, let's say that a person might be interested in, writing, say, a fictional book about him. You might be aware that this has actually already happened. It's called the Book of Enoch. The earliest portions of the Book of Enoch were written sometime between 300 and 200 BC, and more portions were written after that. We have no evidence at all that the Book of Enoch actually goes back any further than that, much less past the days of Moses, who never mentions anything about it, past the flood and back to Enoch himself. That the church taught itself various ideas from the fiction in the Book of Enoch is just as silly as the church teaching itself ideas from the fiction of the Left Behind series. What fictions, you might ask? Well, if you've ever heard of, for example, The Watchers, they come from the Book of Enoch. There are a lot of things we think about that come from the Book of Enoch. Now, what can we learn from actual Enoch? Moses has very little to say about him, but he does say this much. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. The term used for he was not is a repeat of the same term used in Genesis 2:5, in which Moses said, there was no man to work the ground. In other words, the man did not exist. We might read this to mean that Enoch ceased to exist entirely, both in body and in spirit, but the nature of the passage doesn't actually indicate this. Why would God utterly annihilate Enoch from existence if he were pleased with him? Rather, we understand that Enoch simply no longer existed on the earth. Just like in Genesis 2:5, no man existed on the earth. He no longer existed on earth because God had taken him. The word for taken is lakha. And it means to take, to seize, to buy, to marry, or to accept. That's a lot of, to marry. I like that one in there. It's a transfer from, oh, this is going to get me in trouble. It's a transfer from one ownership to another. Oh, you're saying we own each other. In other words, Enoch was once on the earth, man's domain on the earth. But you see, God took him. So now he is of God's domain in the heavens. God took him from the earth. He's now in the heavens. Moses is giving the Hebrews a fascinating example. So juxtapose Abel and Enoch. Abel was favored by God. But of course, Abel died in this world. Enoch, however, so favored God that he never tasted death. He so favored God that God expunged the penalty which he swore to Adam and that was passed down from father to son and to all who carry Adam's image, an image marred by sin. So what does this mean? If Enoch could please God so much that God expunged this penalty, could he not do the same for anyone else if he so desired? Are we not seeing in this that God is watching man, looking for opportunities to vacate the sins of man and to restore righteousness to the relationship again? Moses is showing the Hebrews to continue looking up. Continue looking up. Once they have achieved the righteousness of Abel, keep looking further up. There's always more of God's graciousness and righteousness to behold. Just keep looking further up. And once you've reached the righteousness of Enoch and you look up, further up even more again, you'll be looking directly into the face of God himself. For then when you've reached the righteousness of Enoch, you'll truly be standing in the presence of God. Now, we have further ideas for exactly why God may have taken Enoch and then later taken Elijah, having to do with, for example, eschatology. But Moses didn't have any ideas like this. I mean, he long predates Elijah, much less anything after that. He's discussing this story for non-eschatological reasons. And we shouldn't confuse the one for the other. Moses is giving us the example that we need of continually pushing towards that righteousness and that relationship with God. Because one day, you too could just simply step into the presence of God himself. 25 to 29. When Methuselah had lived 187 years, he fathered Lamech. Methuselah lived after he fathered Lamech 782 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Methuselah were 969 years, and he died. Well, it's about time. Whew. When Lamech had lived 182 years, he fathered a son, and called him Noah, saying, Out of the ground that the Lord has cursed, this one shall bring us relief from our work and from the painful toil of our hands. When Noah is born, his father says that Noah will bring rest from their painful toil. Much like the words much like the words Eve said over Cain, it looks again like they're hoping that this child, yet another child, will be the one promised to crush the head of the Nahash. You have to wonder how many generations they were hoping. They were hoping, this is the one, this is the one. And indeed, Noah would bring relief, but not the relief that the people desired. This is an ongoing theme throughout the scriptures, and particularly in the Pentateuch. The desires of man, usually to avoid pain, being overridden by the superior plan of God. And we get to the time of Christ, don't we know it? The plan of God was vastly superior to the plan of man of what they wanted to do with the Messiah. Lamech wanted Noah to crush the head of the Nahash and to bring relief to humanity's toil, perhaps by restoring humanity to the garden of God. I want to be careful not to state whether Lamech's motives were right or wrong, or go deep into them, because honestly, we know nothing more about Lamech than what it says here. It just doesn't tell us. We don't even know if Lamech served God, though it would seem that he seems to have, just based on the surface. However, what we do have is this. Lamech wants life to be better, but God wants the world to be righteous. So if rest is to occur, something has to give. And Moses will bring this to culmination in the next few chapters with God's solution. Lamech's words over Noah are intended to be read like a guaranteed blessing or like a prophecy. That is, Moses put the text here as a setup or a lead-in to the next portion of the story. Lamech wants rest or rescue from the curse on the ground. The coming destruction of the world takes place in light of this statement. That is, the coming flood is, in fact, bringing rest and peace and rescue to the earth. Now, of course, it's only sensible to say, how would a worldwide deluge, that destroys almost every living being on the earth, be rest or rescue? That seems completely counterintuitive. And that's a very sensible question. The first part of the answer is simply this. If the cure is the annihilation of almost everything, how bad was the disease? That is, if God saw that he had to destroy all the living things on the earth and wipe out 99.5% of the people alive, how bad were things? The second part of the answer is this. Some part of humanity, through Noah himself, would be spared. Sin is like cancer. It grows and it spreads and it destroys its own host. Killing that cancer often involves using harsh chemicals, toxins and radiation and surgery. They're devastating to the health of the patient. They are painful, it is long, and it is grueling. But to keep the patient alive at all, they're required. The coming flood is like chemotherapy. In order to spare the patient, that is, the existence of humanity itself, something radical had to occur. 30 to 32. Lamech lived after he fathered Noah 595 years and had other sons and daughters. Thus all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. After Noah was 500 years old, Noah fathered Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Now, before I get into talking about whether or how people lived for a zillion years, I need to discuss a fairly quiet bit of disagreement in scholarship. Well, biblical scholars work really hard to try to, tease out the exact words by authors of Scripture with stunning agreement, I might add. There's one area of disagreement I need to mention just briefly here. The ages of the patriarchs in Genesis 5 and chapter 11 is disparate between the Masoretic text, which is what our Bibles generally follow, and the Septuagint, which was the Bible the apostles in the early church read. And while discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls helped us to resolve several disagreements that the two texts have with each other, the portion of the Dead Sea Scrolls that contain Genesis 5 and 11 were destroyed. They don't exist. And we have one little fragment. It's got the name of Kenan on it. Great. We know he was in there. This is what they call in the scientific community, that's a technical term, a bummer. The disagreement is over the beginning years and the death years of the patriarchs. For example, the Masoretic text, For example, the Masoretic text says that Adam was 130 years old when he begat Seth, and that is what you will have in your Bible, probably. But the Septuagint says that he was 230 years old. So, that's a little bit of a difference in age. Added together, if you count all the patriarchs in Genesis chapter 5, the Septuagint's pre-flood era is about 600 years longer than what the Masoretic text gives. Now, why should you care? It's not like we live then. Well, you might not, and good for you if you don't. You might look at this and you say, seriously? Okay. I don't care. Good. Continue to not care. It's a great position to take on this one. But if you are interested in researching anything that has to do with the years of the patriarchs, for example, like when I was a little kid, I just wanted to add them together because I loved math and it was cool. It's helpful to understand something having to do with this particular debate. So before you do that, take some time to read the article MTSP or LXX by Henry B. Smith Jr. and read through the From Adam to Abraham material at BibleArchaeology.org. I find that the argument that the LXX numbers, that's the Septuagint's numbers, should be generally accepted to be quite compelling. Other people strongly disagree. That's how disagreements are. And when we all die and we all see Jesus, none of us will actually care anymore about the question anyway. And so ultimately it honestly doesn't matter. All right. Now for the arguments over ages. How many people, raise your hands, William, how many people actually think that Methuselah lived to be 969 years old? Go. Okay. For perspective, if Robin Hood never died, supposing he ever actually lived, he would be about 860 years old today. He would still have over 100 years left to go before reaching Methuselah's age. Now, it's impossible for humans to live that long. Clearly, obviously. And of course, we know that it's never been possible. And the reason why we know it's never been possible is because we have never seen it happen. And if we haven't seen it happen, then we know it doesn't happen. Right? This is why a quarter of people are certain, for example, without any shadow of a doubt, that we never landed on the moon. Why? Because they never saw it happen. And they figure it's impossible. So it never happened. I think that's how the logic goes. It's also the same reason why people know that Jesus never rose from the dead. They didn't see it happen, and people don't come back from the dead. Therefore, it didn't happen. That's logicking for you. Of course, today, funny thing, the debate about the age thing is beginning to shift rather forcefully from science. So our knowledge of DNA and other factors is giving us more and more insights into exactly why our bodies age. And it seems that it doesn't actually have to be that way at all. Consider this. When you're young, Your body doesn't break down with time. In fact, quite to the opposite, it progresses and grows and it gets stronger with time. Then for a while, your body stays in absolutely perfect working condition. I mean, you could like hit yourself with a truck and you will recover. I don't recommend it. Don't try it. Lawyers? No, they say don't say that. Don't hit yourself with a truck. And then for some unknown reason, it begins to degrade. The question is, why exactly does it stop staying in perfect condition? What triggers the body to say, all right, I'm done repairing everything. Time to go downhill. Early results from modern science say perhaps there's actually nothing about aging that turns out to be mandatory. Perhaps with certain DNA corrections and environmental corrections, we might be able to live forever. Now, say what you will about whether or not this is a good idea or bad idea. I think it's a terrible idea. It does mean this. Presuming a young earth creation history, the people before the flood would have had excellent genetics. Why? Well, since Adam and Eve had perfect genes and degradations take generations to pile up, everybody in the early history would have had nearly perfect genetics. And the environment would have been ideal for maintaining long life because it was still, as God said, good. Only after the destruction of the flood would all this have changed, because both the pinching of the DNA at the time of Noah, everybody else being wiped out, now everybody's got just Noah's genes, and throwing the world into an entirely different system of climates, that would have messed things up. So consider this. The Earth's environment was such that certain dragonflies had wingspans up to 3 feet long. That's a dragonfly. And we know this because we actually have their fossils. Now, this is completely impossible today. I mean, it cannot occur. All I'm saying is that it's only reasonable to surmise that in that environment, with an undegraded genetic structure, humans could have lived much, much, much longer than we do now. Now, there are other theories about the ages, namely that these ancient people were actually a series of people instead of one person represented by the name of one man, and they all lived to be 30 to 45 years old before all dying from tooth decay or something horrendous. But this theory is apparently quite new, starting in the 1800s. And if you know me, you know that I'm deeply suspicious of any theological idea that was invented after the first century. It's not unreasonable to say that the only reason this idea was even invented was to align with a naturalistic worldview. And if you're a naturalist, you're going to reject the whole Bible anyway. So why bother trying to align with it? Look, I get that it's hard saying, I really do think that people live to be stupidly old ages. But it's also hard to say, I really do think that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a chariot of fire. And I really do think that God gave the Hebrews manna to eat in the desert. And I really do think that Balaam's donkey talked to him. Or how about, I really do think that when the Hebrews marched around Jericho, that the walls fell down. Or how about, I really do think that when Sennacherib laid siege to Jerusalem, that in a single night, God killed 185,000 of their soldiers. And more importantly, I really do firmly claim and believe without shaking that Jesus Christ was born of a virgin, was killed by crucifixion at the hands of the Romans and chief priests, was buried in a borrowed tomb, was resurrected into his present and eternal body, testified about his own resurrection to his family and his disciples, and then was lifted up in front of them all to finally be seated at the right hand of God in heaven. There's no doubt that the way of God requires us to believe that God is interacting in our world in amazing and sometimes shocking ways. But so what? The way of God is exciting exactly because it is amazing and shocking. And if God is real, isn't that only reasonable? Next time, we'll step into more incredibly controversial things in Genesis chapter 6.